the episodes of genocide and annihilation that we see. But that only, I think, reinforces the point that there are certain, moral imperatives that are, still as valid today as they were in antiquity, and those values have to be perpetuated and have to be strengthened and have to be taught.
I don't think any of the four of us necessarily disagree with that.
I understand that.
Even farther, though.
So what I'm trying to say is that, true, things change and circumstances change. We're living in a different world, but there are certain key elements that are immutable, and those key elements have to be at the center of any sort of a moral discussion or any metaphysical discussion.
Which is, to a very great degree, why metaphysics. Not necessarily yours, not necessarily this one or any alternative one, but why it's so important is because we have such a tendency in the contemporary world, our 21st century world, toward moral relativism, where this concept of good and evil have actually been discombobulated to where good and evil are considered the same thing. But indeed, it's remarkable that the God and Evil book is black, and the God and Good book is white. I'm using the Crib Notes edition. I just couldn't carry that with me. But I don't know that in another context, I don't know that people would necessarily look at it that way. I'm not sure that if it wasn't that at least God and Evil has a more traditionally Jewish background, that perhaps, maybe they would have had both book covers gray.
It's very colorful.
Yes.
I think that even in contemporary times, many people, myself included, would say that good is good and evil is evil, including probably everybody at the table. And I would conjecture that from time immemorial, there were people who said it's all what you call it. People intoxicated with power might say it's all relative. Now, so that we're all agreeing that we like to believe there are absolutes. As for Jewish philosophy, Jewish philosophy is always perceived as somewhat risque. Like, where will this lead us? The joke, it might lead to mixed answer, But part of the reason it's so risque is that there's no good backstop, no good language at the end of the road which says, this is it.
But there is a good backstop.
Okay, well,
that's exactly what Professor Garrin was talking about, it's halacha.
Right. So the backstop is traditionally is halacha, right, well, the Torah, right. Fine, but, that works for some people, it doesn't work for other people. And it works for the Jews maybe better than non-Jews. So, if you're already teaching Torah, then why get involved in Jewish philosophy if you're not quite sure where the discussion leads? Does it lead to a zone which undermines the whole Jewish academy? So I'm saying it does not undermine the Jewish academy, it strengthens the Jewish academy.
It strengthens the foundation of the Jewish academy.
Right.
That brings me two thoughts, just as you were saying that, two thoughts popped in my head. I once mentioned to a colleague of mine that Judaism ultimately is a fighting religion. Why? Because we're always arguing. Who are we arguing with? We argue with anybody. We argue with each other, right? You get two Jews together, they have three opinions. But we even argue with God. What does Israel mean? The name Israel, Yisrael. We just a few weeks ago read that in Shul.
The wrestler.
He who wrestles with God and overcomes him. Abraham. I was mentioning exactly. Throwing back at God, shall the doer of justice not act justly? Throughout biblical literature, throughout Talmudic literature, there are constant points. There's been slightly telescoped special on PBS last year, I think 2 years ago. God on Trial, I think. I don't remember the exact title of the show, but it dealt with the subject of a Din Torah, a traditional rabbinical court that was brought together. The actual historical court took place in Italy in 1946, and where they tried God. They said, look, you have a lot of answers. This is like Ricky We'll see, you've got lots of explaining to do. You know, God, you've got to answer for the fact that you made certain commitments in your covenant with us, and you didn't keep them. And by the way, just before you jump in, because I'm more than happy to hear what you have to say, but they found God guilty, and they weren't afraid of it.
God is always guilty in these trials. Whenever the rabbis take on God, one thing you can bet on is that God is going to lose.
Well, he didn't mount much of a defense. So.
Well, it's like I'm afraid to Shabbos, right?
Yeah.
You're already going to bring the action.
There's a famous story about the Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, who brings, no, it's a different story, but he was the famous one who was arguing with God and debating with God. And he says to God on Yom Kippur, he says, "Dear God," he says, "you know, this year you have to write everybody in the good book." He says, "Okay. And this year you cannot write anybody in the bad book." He says, "Why not?" He says, "Because this year Yom Kippur is on Shabbos and you can't write on Shabbos." So God says, "So how could I write them in the good book?" He says, "To save a life." Because God always loses.
But the point is, and you make the point, true, the whole notion of the argumentation, the shakla v'tari in the back, but it's all elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. There has to be some structure in which to place the argument, and you can only go so far with it.
No, but then the backdrop always has to be it's look, that was the scandal of the 18th century, was the antinomian, anti-halachic tendencies within Hasidism that shocked the rabbinic world, you know. But on the other hand, maybe the Hasidic movement had an idea, you know, this idea of hitlavut, of hislavus, yidvet Hashem b'simcha, you know, was missing this joy, this enthusiasm, this just giving yourself over at some point to the spiritual side.
It didn't deny normative Judaism.
There was a question about it.
Well,
yeah, I mean,
go and thought about it.
It's not right. Yeah, I mean,
But today it no longer applies.
No, it doesn't. Right. Yeah. But they were, you know, not necessarily actions, but tendencies. You don't daven.
No, the Golem was not happening.
You don't daven at any particular time. You daven when the internal thing tells you, you know, your spirit says, okay, now I'm going to daven shacharit, even if it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You know, it was never completely antinomian, obviously. It wasn't.
By antinomian, you mean
anti-halacha, anti-observance of normative Jewish law.
Right. I think soon we'll sort of wrap up with sort of parting shots. Maybe go around the table once or twice. Sort of parting shots or perspective on discussion or on the works. Who would like to start parting shot? We can always wrap around a second time for a parting shot on top of the parting shot.
I would like to deal with totality, of dealing with the entire question, dealing with the entire answer, putting all the cards on the table, and dealing with it from a human perspective, from a divine perspective, from a historical perspective, and hoping that this metaphysics is the groundwork which is presenting a good divine pattern for human beings to follow, for Jews to follow, for non-Jews to follow. And if there's a good theology, it applies to everyone. It should not be so, you know, narrow and denominational. Right. And I think that you're certainly on the track of producing that.
Is there anything you like about the books?
Actually, I would fall in that category. I really like the notion of quest for potential, right, but maybe separated out from you know, the ties you have with God and trying to draw an analogy. I found that a bit unsettling, but certainly the concept, 100%. I mean, we used to think in the Age of Enlightenment, I guess, that people were evolving in a positive way, moving towards a greater potential and so on. It didn't turn out that way. But you know, certainly there has to be some sort of goal, which I believe goal has to be based on certain morals, principles, in the case of Judaism, certain halachic standards and so on. I guess it could be universalized, but Judaism is a very unique belief system, and I don't think it works outside of, for Jews anyway, it doesn't work outside that, you know, that format or that paradigm, you know, of halachic man. But certainly, I could see the universal application.
I would respond only in one point to what you said, Dr. Garrin. That is, perhaps we have to modify our view of this process of higher, further, etc., and state, the higher the fall, or the higher the accomplishment, the bigger the fall when you do have a fall, when there is a collapse. I also would like, just as I was rereading, I read God and Evil for purposes of full disclosure when it first came out in 1988, and I actually wrote a review which has to have been, by all accounts, the most vacuous book review ever written, because I didn't understand a lot of what you were saying at the time, and I was hurried, harried, and fachaded, as they say, which I still am. I'm a lot older now than I was then, and maybe a little wiser. One thing that, as I was rereading, came to me was the famous saying, Lo alecha halacha ligmor, v'lo ata ben korin li pater mimena. You can't necessarily finish the answer, but you can't, on the same time, you're not permitted to stop trying. You have to keep, that's the nature of man, is that we are curious and we want to find out, we want to understand, we want to know. This is exactly the quest for potential that you're talking about. And I think in that respect, you're right on the money. Whether the metaphysics is good or not, I'm not sufficiently...
Time will tell.
Right, I'm not sufficiently educated to be able to say for sure.
100%, that's the nature of man.
Should I lean on you for a parting shot, on top of a parting shot?
No, you can have the point. Sum it up.
I never heard good answers to these key questions growing up. I went to lectures, I read the articles. Then I finally went to Harvard Hillel, frankly, Friday nights, and they had top guns in the Jewish world, one after the other. And nobody gave a satisfying, even attempted response. So, Summa Metaphysica may be right and may be wrong, but it presents what I feel to be as a very powerful, viable option. And yes, time will tell where it stands. I want to thank this distinguished panel for joining us today, this afternoon, and we'll take it to the next step. Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.